people will join us, but let's get started this morning. Happy Friday, everyone. This is an exciting adventure for us today. My name is Lori Ebbison. I'm the Executive Committee, the chairperson of CAC, and this is our first ever learning session nationwide by webinar. We've also invited, along with the CAC members across the country, we've also invited REAC, NEAC, and NBA board members. So the topic today is all about Policy 101. We're very privileged to have Luc Besson, the Director of Strategic Policy, to guide us through an overview of policy development process, provide us with some tips. As you know, volunteers like CAC are invited to take part in external consultations around policies, and it's truly a privilege for us to be able to weigh in on policies as they're being developed. So not surprising to any of us, corrections is certainly a policy-driven environment, so I think, again, it helps us understand more about the context within which we're volunteering. So thank you, Luc. I'll turn it over to you. And if we'll have time after the presentation to dialogue with Luc and ask some questions and maybe put him on the hot seat just a little bit, but we'll see what happens. So over to you, Luc.
Sounds good. Thank you for having me, and I hope as a first try we'll make this useful for all of you. So as Lori said, I am the director responsible for strategic policy. We're also the lead for corrections on any cabinet business. So we work on policy at various levels, and I will walk you through a presentation. I probably won't read through every single slide. Some are to give you a very high-level perspective as to where we're starting from and what areas we play in. Obviously, for your perspective or for your benefit, I will want to focus a little bit more time in terms of how we work on our internal policies and how you're an important player in that process. So I'll go through the slides, and if there's any questions throughout the presentations, it's kind of hard not having the visuals, so I'll stop at certain points and ask if there's questions. And if at any point you don't see or you don't hear me anymore, please let me know through a voice prompt. And I apologize in advance. I'm working from home, so today I've got my son at home with me, and we have a small dog. So if you hear barking, that's who's barking. So I'll start now. I don't know if we didn't really do a round table to see who's there. It might be difficult, but I like to have an idea. So what we'll do, we'll just do a scan through the country. We'll start out west in BC. I know we've got, I believe, Robert, or is it Robert from
Andrew. I think I'm the west one. I'm in Victoria. I'm on the Victoria Parole CAC. Andrew Bateman. I think I'm the westernmost guy. Yes.
And as we go east, anybody else from British Columbia? No? In Alberta?
Janet Anderson. I'm with the NBA.
Excellent. Welcome. Anybody from,
oh, sorry. Excuse me. Hi, I'm Deirdre Crandall. I'm from the EIFW, the CAC.
Excellent. Welcome. Okay. And if nobody else from Alberta, we'll keep moving east. And you'll see if I'm geographically challenged. So next up would be in Manitoba.
No, you skipped Saskatchewan, Luc. You definitely are geographically challenged, but try not to take offense. Try not to take offense. So at regional headquarters
in Winnipeg, CAC.
Excellent. I'm just checking if people are attentive.
Excellent. Good plan.
Excellent. Anybody else? So it's a bit of a mix between Saskatchewan and Manitoba, but anybody else from those two provinces? No. Anybody up north? No. Okay. As we move east in Ontario. Okay, nobody in Ontario. Anybody from the Quebec province in English? No. Okay. And to do the Maritimes as a big group. So anybody from the Maritimes or the Atlantic? Okay. So we'll get going, and as I said, as I slide through the slides, I'm hoping everybody's seeing, so you just see a change in pages here. If someone can let me know. Okay, I'll assume it's working for everyone.
No, so, actually, nothing's changed here. Did you change?
I'm seeing the title page is up, yes.
Okay, well, so I've just changed to slide 2, and if you haven't received the presentation ahead of time, we'll make sure you get a copy afterwards.
Okay.
As I said, I won't read through it all, so there's obviously a lot of information here which you can benefit from. So, you know, obviously, what is policy? Seems simple, but essentially, policy is often the result of changes in priorities or new legislation coming into force, or obviously any changes to the Canadian society requiring that we adjust the way we do things. And for CSC, obviously, it takes the form of commissioners' directives, guidelines, and a number of tools and policy bulletins that essentially set out what are the expectations from the commissioner, from the organization, from staff, and to clearly outline processes as well as responsibilities that are attached to these policies. We have over 200 and some policies, whether it be directives or guidelines, so there's quite a number of documents out there. They are all, for the most part, available through our InfoNet, to our staff, to inmates through the inmate libraries, and in some cases in paper format, and also available on our website. So if you go to the CSC website under the section titled Publications, you can find legislation and policies. You will find the Commissioner's directives, guidelines, and policy bulletins there. Obviously, they're all available in English and in French as well. So, you know, essentially, policies are stemming from, our regulations, our legislation. They can provide more precision and set out the process, but obviously cannot go beyond the scope of our legislation and regulations that are in place. So in a nutshell, that's where they're coming from. As we look at the government structure, seems complex, but essentially we seek or we get our direction from Parliament, whether it comes through the Senate or from the House of Commons. Bills will set out expectations from various agencies that are mandated to put in practice these policy instruments. And so that's where we get our authority. Our commissioner gets the authority to establish policies. And as I slide through slide 4 here, obviously from our perspective, as we advise the minister and cabinet, we are there to provide advice, to give our views in terms of what legislation is needed, or how legislation will impact operations, and what could be amended to work better and achieve the goals of the government. But at the end of the day, we need to implement as loyally as possible, and we have to ensure the instruments to make those legislation pieces come to reality. I'll go quickly through the next few slides. Essentially, it gives you an idea of how we shape policy through either cross interdepartmental work or stemming from our own internal work. You know, the process itself is pretty well set out. It's been in place for quite a while in terms of how the government gives direction to departments. I must say there has been in the last year or so a clear intent to engage public servants and Canadians broadly in terms of developing policy. So we've increasingly seeing an opportunity to feed into the policy development process, obviously at the legislative level, as well as how we work with other departments and agencies in moving our agenda or our policies forward. And that is one of the reasons why I thought it important to connect with all of you. Is obviously you've all been engaged throughout the process when we seek input into our policies, and I've had numerous discussions with Lori on how you can feed into that. To us, it's quite important. It's important to us to ensure that policies are clear. To ensure that we've considered every single angle. We're never going to get everything perfect, but getting as many views as possible will help us get the best document out there. Obviously, we're seeking input, and it always puts us in a situation where we can never always please everyone. Consensus is sought but cannot always be achieved. But as we move forward, I'm definitely going to be looking for your views as we develop policies, not only on the policies themselves, but how we can improve the process. So you understand, you have the information needed to feed into that process, and that we understand your feedback. And to close the loop in terms of giving you essentially the end product and perhaps enough information to understand as to the why and how the policy was developed. So I'll definitely want to address that through questions. But the first 10 to 12 slides of the presentation essentially set out the big P policy, as we call it, as to how we play into broad government policy making. Obviously, as one of the departments under the public safety portfolio, we are encouraged, and we are essentially working as a portfolio in terms of how we share information with other agencies, whether it be the RCMP, CDSA, et cetera. So we have an opportunity through the portfolio to ensure that we're consistent across organizations, that we share best practices and lessons learned. And so we go through public safety for any legislation, regulatory changes, any presentations to cabinet. Everything goes through public safety, who essentially manages the relationship with the minister and government. So that's our context from a big P policy perspective. And as you probably know, there's a number of ways government will introduce changes to big P policy. It's through legislation, whether it be private members' bills or government bills. And this government has been very open to considering private members' bills. So we're seeing an increasing number of those. and each bill that goes to the House or the Senate is being looked at and assessed as if it were a government bill or a private member's bill. There's no difference in terms of how these are being looked at. We've probably looked there's been 20 or 30 bills we've looked at in the last session. Some have no implications for CSV. Others have remote or minimal implications, and others obviously directly impact us. Some recent examples I could give you are the Medical Assistance in Dying Act that did pass during the last session, and one current bill we're closely monitoring is the Bill C-16 on the gender identity or gender of expression. So adding those two elements to the criteria under the Human Rights Act as reasons not to discriminate. So, you probably know the process that's on slide 11 in terms of how bills go through the House. I won't necessarily walk you through that. And on slide 12, what is interesting, you might want to refer to that link. We're giving you the link to the House of Commons or Parliament, I should say. They keep a record of all bills that are in front of the House and the Senate, and you can follow their process. You can read any amendments that are made to the bills. You can also see records of discussions and debates as they occur. So that is all available. That's all available online through that parliament.gc.ca website. I'll stop here. That's probably the big key to the presentation. Don't know if there's any questions at this point.
Any questions, comments?
No?
Luke, I have a question. It's Lori.
Sure.
I'm interested in, you've identified that there is new legislation, and medical assistance in dying was one of the examples that you provided. Can you tell us a little bit more about the process of developing a whole new area of policy? Just a little brief summary of the steps taken. Presumably within corrections, research might have a play. Like how many sectors and what does that really look like within the correctional environment?
So from our perspective, when a bill gets introduced, and I'll use that one as an example. Because this one was a government bill, we get engaged earlier on in the sense where, we get engaged even before the bill is drafted. And so we're at that point, there is a minister that leads these changes. In that case, was the Minister of Health. Essentially, we get asked, what are the impacts to the department? And each department gets asked the same question. That's when we, tap into the various sectors. Obviously, there's a health component, but we also seek input from our COP sectors, so the correctional operations and programs sector. We also seek input, and I'm giving you these examples because they're essentially from a general perspective that's who will engage. So the correctional operations and program sector, the health services sector, obviously, the women, so Deputy Commissioner of Women would get involved. We'll also seek input from the Aboriginal Initiative Directorate, as well as any other sector that would have implications. So, obviously legal services is often called upon to look at, application, to look at bills from an application perspective or from a to see if there's any conflict with existing legislation. And so we feed into the government through, a memorandum or presentation to cabinet, and that gets, hopefully, gets reflected in adjustments to legislation before it gets tabled. Once legislation is tabled, as it evolves to the House, we will be called upon to, advise as to is there any other impacts to our current operations or policy. And that will happen as well in the case of private members' bills. So we will be asked to give government our views as to how it would impact our department. So essentially that's how we feed into early in the bill and how it gets drafted. Once it goes through the House, obviously we have to wait for bills to get royal assent or close to before we start amending our own policy. One example or a good example was that bill, C-14, on medical assistance in dying, changed substantially throughout the parliamentary process, whether it be in the House or the Senate. So we have to wait for the final version, obviously not to engage folks and have policies too much in flux. Once that happens, we have a bill in place. We go through our typical policy development process, and I'll walk you through that in a few minutes. I won't necessarily, I can do that now if there's no other questions on the big P policy process or that framework. But essentially it'll be the usual process to develop policy, whether it be internal, as we're reviewing policies, or as we develop new policies that are stemming from legislation.
Thank you. One follow-up question I'll just ask. I realize you're going to walk us through the process a little bit more. What's the process for, or is there any external oversight? So in medical assistance in dying, that's a prime example. Is there a layer of external oversight that would look across agencies in terms of how they're implementing the bill?
So the oversight would occur either through Treasury Board. They will ask for reports in terms of its implementation. So usually bills will be tied to initiatives that are going to be measured and reported against. So there will be oversight. In this case, I'll be frank, the oversight I know will occur through Health Canada. Not quite sure at this point, how it will happen on the ground. In other cases that I've seen that I know a bit more, there will be performance measures attached to the initiative, not necessarily to the bill itself, but to the initiative that is driving that legislative change. And that's what's used to report and monitor implementation. So through the channels now, either through reports, the DPR, Departmental Performance Reports, or through follow-ups by the OAG, and Parliament might request, departments to come back to committees and present progress reports. So one last piece I should say, in some cases, not all cases, there will be a mandatory review period. So essentially either after 3 years or 5 years in some cases, there will be a mandatory review. That usually would get done through a parliamentary committee where they would, request documents, request proof in terms of results, and essentially through various testimonies and presentations to the committee, assess the impact the bill has had. That would be certainly, I assume, the case for Bill C-14. I'm not quite sure what the period is, but when there is a new bill that's essentially changing or introducing a new initiative, there will be that review period that's mandatory and put in place as the bill is tabled and receives royal assent.
Thank you.
Interesting.
A very long answer to your question, and we'll get back to the internal policy process in a minute.
Great. Any other questions before Luke carries on?
Luke, I don't know, it's David here, just more from a technical side. I'm looking at the screen that's showing from your end, and the timestamp is just frozen at 11:53. I don't know if there's something that you can do at your end at all to activate it, but that's probably the reason why. It's like we have a screenshot, and that's all coming from your computer. I'm not asking you to do too much about it, but unless there's an obvious button that you could push. Otherwise, please continue.
Okay, I'm just changing through the screen here just to see if there's a message or there's something wrong with the network, but there doesn't seem to be, so I'm not quite sure what's happening.
Yeah, okay.
Is the screen changing now, or it's still the same?
No, we still have the title page.
And the time at the bottom is 11:53 a.m., so it hasn't moved.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's just frozen. It seems to be frozen, the screen. We'll do some exploring about what that means later.
Okay. I'll just try one last thing here to see if it's the network or, yeah, it's really odd. It seems to be connected. No, all the signals seem fine. That's too bad because I want to show you, and I don't know if I try, David, to disconnect or not disconnect, but give you back the control.
Yeah.
And maybe take it back again.
Okay, let's give that a try. Oh, here's it.
Oh, boy.
Are you seeing something new?
Yeah, we see the screen now.
Got the overview of the policy development process, which is slide.
Okay. It's not a slide, actually. It's a document that I want to show you. We only have it in English. I'm going to show it to you on the screen. It's something we've developed recently to demystify the whole process. While we've got a number of documents laying it out, I think a picture's worth 1,000 words sometimes, and this is probably the case. But before we dive into that, I just want to go back to the presentation itself. If you see it? You still see it?
We see it. Yeah.
Yes.
We see your arrow moving. We can see what you're doing now.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So what I'll do, I won't go to full screen because that seems to be the issue. I'll just go through the presentation here where we were essentially on slide 12. And you should have that in electronic format. If not, David, let's make sure we share that with participants.
For sure.
So essentially, the first 12 slides set out the big P process. In terms of our own, policy process, obviously, I gave you the context earlier, so I won't read through that again. That was slide 13. In terms of slide 14, just to give you a sense of, what would trigger policy changes. So anything from changes to legislation, to regulations, any responses to boards of investigation, audits, whether they be internal or from the OAG, decisions from the courts, and obviously through feedback, whether it be staff, whether it be feedback from you, or from inmates, and we've had a couple of cases where, and I've seen that recently where we've had a complaint from an inmate, and we walked through it, and there was actually a lot of work behind that and mediation involved. And at the end of the day, we landed with policy changes that both responded to data inmates' concerns, but also made it clearer and made it a better policy document. So there's a number of sources that can trigger policy changes, which makes it interesting and complex at the same time. But you've got to keep that in mind. So it's not always, even though we try to plan things and we set out 2-year review periods to review our policies in a systematic fashion, oftentimes what we're seeing is changes being made as we get feedback from staff and as we get feedback from stakeholders and inmates or external sources, as I laid out. So I think that's important to note. I talked about the various policy documents. I won't read through those. You can see those on slide 15. On slide 16, we've got somewhat of a visual of the process at a very, very high level. I'll show you the other chart in a minute. I think that's a little bit clearer. And I can talk to you about consultation. We'll talk about that in a minute as well. And then we talk about the promulgation process. On slide 19, you see there our email address. If there's any questions in terms of how to interpret policy or concerns in terms of how the policy is implemented or how the policy could be made clearer, you can email that address. That is the address that is put on each policy document as well. So you'll find it on the policy bulletin as well as on the directive itself. At the end, you'll get a contact address or information. We won't necessarily always answer those questions from the policy sector. In some cases, when it gets technical, we will refer you to the experts. So it's a one-stop shop or point to get answers or to provide feedback. So keep that in mind. You don't have to wait for formal consultation processes to give us your feedback.
Right.
I'll stop there and move on to the other chart you saw briefly, and I'll try to zoom in. All right. So that's from afar the process, and you can see there's basically 4 main parts to it: the planning, the drafting, approvals, and promulgation. And as part of the drafting process, there's obviously consultations, and you'll see there's a number of steps in that whole process. I've also often been asked, how many steps is there? I'll say 12, which are essentially key points in the process. There's 12 key points in the process. There's obviously more steps than that, as you can visually see there. I'll quickly walk you through them, and then we'll go to questions. So the first part is obviously planning. We talked about the triggers. We'll then select the right policy instrument. So is it a new directive? Is it a guideline? Is it simply a policy bulletin to provide more guidance? Or it may be a subject matter expert communication, either through case management bulletins, security bulletins, etc. Or it might be a tool. And in many cases, I must be frank, we often think we need policy, but in many cases, what's required is training to ensure that people understand the policy and know how to implement it. So it's not always automatic that we'll go to policy development. Then we'll obviously start from a first draft or a template to kick the work off. And many times we're starting from something that exists and go through the drafting process. So without walking through every single step, so steps 4 to 8, what you'll be interested to see, and what we're communicating systematically to our what we call OPIs, or the subject matter experts of the policy, and those are usually defined at the very start of the policy. You'll see who is the Office of Primary Interest, and we'll start with that sector, but obviously involve all the sectors and areas that need to be involved. And there are 2 opportunities for consultations. There's an opportunity to do it early on as we draft the policy. I'll give you the example of the C14, so the medical assistance in dying example. Our health services sector has reached out to staff, to the medical field, to folks from justice, and have sought input at various stages throughout their drafting process. We encourage that because it allows us to ensure a first draft that we'll send out for official consultation is as thorough as possible. And it allows for informal discussions, allows for more engagement, and for folks to understand where the policy is coming from. So what's driving it, and what are the factors that need to be considered. The other part to consultation is the formal one. So starting from step 7, that's probably what you're most accustomed to, where we'll send out an official memo and it will get distributed to a number of stakeholders. We'll ask you to provide input through templates, and that gets documented. So we'll document the feedback received. The feedback will be assessed by the OPI, so the leading sector, with policy, to determine how it gets incorporated, if it's something that's addressed somewhere else, or if it's something that at this point is not feasible or cannot be considered. So that gets documented, and as we go through the next step, which is essentially the approval process, we'll usually send that off to all of the ExCom, which is essentially all assistant commissioners from all sectors, as well as the regional deputy commissioners. And I know in each case they will consult through their ADCs or at any through their DGs before they sign off. And we still, at that point, may get feedback or changes that are recommended. That will get assessed and will form part of the final package that goes to the commissioner for final approval. There's obviously some exceptions. Guidelines will get signed off by the sector head and not the commissioner. In some cases, we might not go through consultations. An example of that is anything coming from a change to language or from legal services in terms of ensuring that we have clarity in the language or consistency between instruments that unfortunately wasn't caught early on. Those are kinds of changes we'll put through approvals, but will not necessarily consult. Or if we have court decisions, we might not consult because we don't have any flexibility. Those are examples. There might be others, but for the most part, those would be cases where we don't necessarily consult. And in all cases, or I should say in most cases, we will seek the entire ExCom or the entire senior management committee's approval. There may be some exceptions in cases where it's a technical change, so we're not changing the nature of the policy itself or the responsibilities attached to staff. We're essentially changing a policy to reflect a change in title or something that's more of a technical nature, or perhaps an error in translation, things like that. Those won't necessarily go through the full approval process. But all policies or directives do get signed off by the Commissioner. At the end of the day, we'll promulgate the policy both on our website and on our intranet or infonet, and that usually gets done on a Monday and gets communicated through a general message, general email to staff, and we obviously make it available in a readable format on the internet and on our infonet. And each quarter, institutional libraries get updated, and any new policies would get added at that point. Okay, so that's the internal policy process in a nutshell. Are there any questions at this point? I suspect there will be more questions on this. Obviously, it's a little bit closer to the ground.
Well, my question is about the end. When things are promulgated, you touched earlier on implementation. When they're promulgated, is there a parallel process for implementation so that everybody understands what the changes are there in terms of getting things rolled out?
So in some cases, wherever we're introducing new policy, obviously the promulgation of policy will be the last step. Yes. As we go through the drafting and approval process, there will be tools developed, there will be Q&As, right. There will be training developed. So that gets done in parallel to the policy process.
I see.
And it all depends on the change. If the change is minute or does not impact a wide audience, it might get done through a bulletin addressed to the staff that are responsible for its implementation. But broad changes will get handled through awareness sessions or training or official communication through memos and Q&As, that sort of thing.
I see.
Any other questions or comments? Luke, I have one about the consultation process, and this might not come as any surprise to you. We're often asked, as part of the National Executive Committee, the timelines associated with some of the consultation, and we've noticed a dramatic increase in the period of time that's being allowed for the external consultation process. So we're very appreciative of that because we have noticed that it's doubled from the 5 days to 10 days within the last few months. So we're very appreciative of that. And I think you already know that part of what we do for consultation is now we try to engage the policymaker directly with our volunteer pool so we can talk about the policy, its background, and then provide feedback directly. I also realize that you have other external stakeholders. What's the uptake from some of the other stakeholder groups like the Parole Board of Canada or the Elizabeth Fry Society or John Howard? How much do you hear back from some of those stakeholder groups?
It will vary case by case, obviously, depending on the policy and the impact for those organizations or perceived impact. We'll get more, more input. It really varies. Like I can't give you a blanket answer in terms of participation, but in cases where it's impacting staff and changes to responsibilities, obviously some stakeholders like our national unions will get quite involved. And are usually involved as other stakeholders are in the early drafting of policies, maybe not in seeing documents, but in terms of having discussions on potential changes and how it could impact them. That's usually led to the sectors responsible for the policy. But in terms of the formal consultations, we're trying to be quite systematic in that process to reach out to everyone, and we do. We will extend to more stakeholders if we feel that the policy may impact others, but we have a standard list of folks we engage in, and I know you see that when we send out the memos, they're usually listed as an annex, but we do extend that as needed. And in terms of timeline, we have put in place a change in terms of increasing the period allowed. We've essentially set it out as a minimum of 10 days, and it does not prevent for periods to be longer. Again, the example of the medical assistance in dying case, I think we allowed 3 to 4 weeks for that consultation. And as much as possible, we'll try to allow as much time that's available, because obviously the more time we give, the more in depth and the better quality we get back. So it's a win-win for everyone.
Great. Well, and thank you again for always including CAC as part of the external stakeholder group. It really is quite informative to have a look at the policies and what they mean and what that means in practice. So we're very appreciative of that. Thank you. Additional questions? Great. Well, if there's no further questions, Luc, thank you so much for doing this. I know you and I have been chatting about this probably for 6 months and trying to confirm the date. So thank you very, very much for fitting this in today. This call will be repeated in another probably 5 to 7 minutes in French. So those of you who would like to take part, the same call-in details take part or are in play. And another huge thank you to our national headquarters colleagues. David and Donna and Suzanne have been working very hard to figure out the technology to allow us to have the internal and external access to the WebEx here, and I think this is a very much appreciated format of our session. Thank you all for your participants.
Great job, guys.
Thank you.
Terrific.
Lori,
Yes.